What's going on, guys? Mike coming back at you with another Gospel Chops drum video. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. It's a little more simple. Really just involves the hands. You could add in the feet afterwards and you're going to see me do some stuff, but it's really at your discretion. A lot of this is really open to interpretation, which is what I love about this fill. Basically just going to be showing you today the grassroots of how I came up with this fill and how it came to be what you saw at the beginning part of that video. The further chapters I'm going to get more into the theory because this is actually a polyrhythmic fill, so it's a little bit more complicated to explain theory-wise for someone that might be new to drum theory or music theory. And for that reason, I'm still going to keep it kind of simple in terms of explanation, and if you guys would like a separate video about theory or polyrhythms, please don't hesitate to let me know in the comment section below, and I'd love to be able to share that with you. The fill is essentially based off of a pattern of fives. So just 5 notes on your hands. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now with fives, they're usually not quite as musical in most contemporary situations, sometimes even in gospel chops. It's hard to sort of explain why. I'll just show you how it sounds. But if I was playing like a regular funky groove like... it could work, but it still sounds a little bit too proggy for that type of groove. And in a lot of musical contexts, it might be kind of hard for the band to feel it, depending on who you're playing with. So what I've done is essentially done 5 against 3 polyrhythm, which is 5 notes in the space of where 3 should normally be. And when we're talking about a type of note that occupies the space of 3 notes, we're usually referring to dotted notes. In this case, I'm following a dotted 8th note pulse, which counts for 3 16th notes. So, and the cool thing about the dotted 8th note pulse is it goes over the bar line, as you probably saw this fill was. So really all I'm doing is I'll have the quarter note pulse over here so you can see. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now those are just fives, but what I'm doing is I'm superimposing the dotted 8th note pulse onto those groupings of 5. So I'm squeezing those 5 notes into that pulse. So this pulse right here. Imagine that as your quarter note lines now, right? Just like this is your quarter note. So that's actually an analogy that I use to explain it. And what I mean by that is what you have to do to sort of keep this time going is very similar to what you'd have to do when you have a quarter note pulse and you're playing 16th notes. You have 4 per quarter, and that's sort of your grounding point. That's what you're following. The dotted 8th note pulse is now becoming that grounding point that you have to fit these 5 notes in now. So all those accents is actually the dotted pulse. And the really cool thing about this fill is you can move it all around the kit, and in some ways it could sound very proggy, in some ways it could sound very simple. If you're just going between 2 cymbals. You could start moving around the toms like that, but the cymbals sound sort of the most basic and applicable. The toms start to get a little bit proggy, and you could even stay on one drum. You could even build it into a groove as well. And basically at the end there, I just turned some of them into triplets. and still sort of playing that same crossover type of feel or type of idea. Now, the cool thing about dotted eighth notes is, and really dotted notes in general, but especially the dotted eighth note pulse, is it has this ability to go over the bar line while still being musical. And there's a reason for that. We're going to get into that in the theory section, and I'll fully explain why. But because you're dealing with something that's going over the bar line, it's a little bit trickier usually to fit it in musically, but with this, it's because it actually ends up taking 4 bars to resolve, which in contemporary music is actually generally what people work in blocks of 4, 8, 16. It's all based around those numbers. So when you take 4 bars to resolve, it sort of just fits in a lot of musical contexts, and I find it very easy to apply in many different styles of music. And you can do that with this fill. The only difference is now you're jamming 5 notes into a space, which you have, if you just end it on 1 bar, you don't actually go on the for. It's 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4. You just end on 4. 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 4. Because what happens is as soon as you play the 1 E and a 2 E and a 3 E and a 3 and a 1 E and a 2, now where it's starting on the next bar is no longer 1 because you're going in spaces of 3. So that's where over the bar line happens. And that's going to be more explained in the theory section. With the dotted eighth note pulse, it's pretty easy to feel where the quarter note is, but once you start jamming 5 notes in there for every single note you have in that bar, it starts to kind of feel ambiguous as to where the quarter note is. And I'll show you right now. I'll have this going on the cowbell here. That was actually the full cycle of it. But if you're not used to that type of rhythm, it could be a little bit tricky at first to stay where you are. But I'll, again, explain that in the theory section, how to properly count this and follow along with it. Now, another cool thing you can do with this is start playing different permutations of it, because with the dotted eighth note pulse, there's a lot of parts of that bar where it kind of falls on a cool note, right? So you could start on like the E of one, you could start on the and of another subdivision. Again, wherever in the sequence of that 4 bars that you are, you could start at a different point, right? So I could start it in the middle of a bar like this. Now, just bear in mind that the amount of times you'll be able to play it without having to go over the bar line will change depending on where you start. Right? There's just endless possibilities of where you could start it. You could even start it sort of on another downbeat, right? In terms of how to actually stick it, I've just been doing single strokes this whole time, but you could do double strokes as well. So the sticking for that is as follows. Right, left, left, right, right, left, right, right, left, left. And it just keeps alternating from there. Right, left, left, right, right, left, right, right, left, left. So basically wherever the accent is, you switch to the other hand for the double, do another double, and then that other alternating hand becomes the accent hand. And some of you may find this easier because for me personally, my double strokes are usually faster than my singles. So in some scenarios, I'll do that, but it really depends on what's more comfortable for you. So it sort of changes the style a little bit because the doubles sound a little bit more pressed than the single strokes do. But again, it's all sort of based on what application you're using and where you're playing it on the kit that will sort of dictate how you do that. Now, in terms of kick placement, so far I've basically just been using the kick to follow those grounding points we were talking about, which is the dotted eighth note pulse. It's basically just following every accent. Now, what you can do is take that away completely, and you have this. The quarter note sort of disappears completely, and that's where it gets a little bit tricky to actually follow where the bar line is, but that also could be used in a really proggy situation where you want to impress the audience or whatever the case may be. Now, the other thing you do is sort of put kicks in between. Now, what I've been doing is sort of playing other fills in between that, and that's where I sort of bring the kicks in. I also pick and choose where I'm putting the kicks. Sometimes I'll put it, sometimes I won't, because if I put it the whole time, it sort of almost feels a little bit too straight and too hit on the head all the time, whereas if you kind of choose where the kicks are, it sounds a little bit more flavorful. Now, what's really tricky about this fill is when you start reaching on different areas that are really far away from the snare drum, it sort of takes a lot of practice to be able to go all that distance and still maintain that crisp speed and sort of roll at that speed, because you have all these different cymbals that are different distances and you have to get used to each and every one of them. So I found this area was the easiest, especially between the hat because it's right there, and the floor tom, sorry. But when it comes to this kind of stuff, where you have stacks way in the corner or even China's way out here, it does get a little bit tricky. But all I do for that, like everything else, practice it slowly, work your way up to it. All right, everybody, so we're at the theory section of the video, and if you've made it this far, essentially this is for those who want to get a little bit more in-depth with what's going on with this fill theory-wise. Basically, what I wanted to do here is just explain what the back end of things are for this fill, and I'm going to start by explaining how the dotted eighth note works. Essentially, it's a note that counts for 3/16ths, and the way dotted notes work, it's a little strange to wrap your head around at first. It's just one of those rules you have to accept. You're always talking about the notes that are smaller. So if you're talking about a dotted quarter, that's worth 3/8 notes. If you're talking about a dotted eighth note, that's worth 3/16 notes. You wouldn't say the dotted eighth is worth 3/8 notes, because that would be incorrect. So, I mean, I have no clue why they actually decided to standardize that and make that the way it works, but I'm sure there is a very good mathematical reason as to why that is. With that said, I've written out the 16th notes here, the counting for it: 1 E and a, 2 E and a, 3 E and a, 4 E and a, and so on. And I just wrote, you can see here there's only 5 notes. I wrote just enough so that it could finish the bar without going over the bar line, and that's why you notice this last note is a quarter note, because I have 1, and there's 3 notes, including itself. That's the other thing. It's always including itself with this counting for 3 type of system. And then you have on the of 1, there's another one. And then 1, 2, 3, there's another one. 1, 2, 3, there's another one. 1, 2, 3, there's another one. So every third note, meaning there's a space of 2 notes in between, you have this dotted eighth. 1 E and a, 2 E and a, 3 E and a, 4. And I'm stopping right on 4 because I want this to count for all of 4. And we know that 4/16 notes, 4 E and a, would be equivalent to 1 quarter note. If I had changed this to a dotted, and this is what I'm going to show you right here, where you can go over the bar line with this. So I'm going to change this to an eighth note and dot it. Now, what's going to happen is this is only going to count up to the So that means that, there would either have to be a rest written there or another note. In this case, we're actually going to put another note. It might be a little bit messy here. I apologize. Same thing as there. There's going to be a dot, right? And now, essentially what happens is we have the is now part of the sequence. 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a 1E and. So now we end up on the and of the next bar, which is what I mean by going over the bar line, because we're not starting on 1 anymore like we did here. We now end up on the and of 1. And if we follow the same sequence, right, 2 notes at a time, we're going to be there, we're going to be there, we're going to be there, and then we're going to be there. And now we're still going to go over the bar line, but we're going to end up at a different spot, which is where I have the next bar. So we have and 1, E, 2 more notes, 2 more notes, 2 more notes. So I like to look at the gap as just 2 notes to not get confused. And now there's 2 notes, and now bar 4 would be 1, and that's going to be our resolve point. That's going to be where this sequence actually restarts, and where we started originally is where we end up again after 3 whole bars, so on the actual 4th bar. And this is what I was saying about the fill being musical, is it really, any type of dotted 8th note fill sounds musical and is usually applicable while still being an over the bar line / polyrhythmic thing in this case, where you're squeezing notes within the pulse. Because it actually follows a 4-bar sequence, which in most contemporary music you have sections of 4, 8, 16, and what have you. This way you can have something that still sort of fits in without being too bland. You can do something a little bit different and something that sounds kind of proggy without actually having to have a prog music application. So look at the highlighted notes, which is where the dotted 8th notes are happening. And it's basically 1, and E, 4, and E, 3, and E, 2, and E, 1. So what's actually happening is you have a number, 1, and E, and then you have another number, and it starts at 4. And if you notice, there's a pattern here. The next number you're going to have is going to be 3, and then it's going to be 2, and then it's going to be 1. So after you start at 1, that same bar will have 4 after the and E. So it's 1 and E, 4 and E, 3 and E, 2 and E, and then 1. Sorry. And the reason I like to look at it this way is because it helps you keep track of where you actually are in the bar. Because, of course, if you're going over the bar line, especially if you're trying to apply it in a musical situation or a band sense, you really want to know where you are in the bar. And that's where you could start getting fancy. Like I said in the fill, you starting over here, and the sequence is over here, and now you're going to be at a totally different point in the sequence, and you can decide where you want to finish it. You don't have to necessarily wait for the sequence to do this whole run and then end up back on 1. You could end it off on the 2. There's so many different ways you could go about it. But the reason I like to show this is because what's essentially happening is you're starting here 2 notes later in the bar for this bar. This is bar 2. Over here, you're starting just 1 note, 1 16th note later. This is 2 16th notes later. And here you end up starting only 1 later. And then eventually it moves back. So it actually, and I find this with any sort of pulse that goes over the bar line, you start going back every 16th note as the bars go on. So if you were doing 5s, for example, then it would take 4 full bars to resolve. And on the 5th bar, you would end up back on 1. You'll notice that everything is going to move. Same thing. The pulse locations are going to move back by a 16th note at a time, only 1 per bar. And again, it's one of those things where I'm not 100% sure. I've asked around. I've asked teachers of mine that I've studied with about this, but it's sort of a confusing thing to wrap your head around. It's definitely an abstract thing to wrap your head around, but it just helps to know that there is a pattern here. And that's what I would focus more on rather than the fact that, it's moving back 1/16th note. That's just kind of cool to know and notice that it's working the way it's supposed to be. basically this pattern where you can figure out what you're counting, because you're basically just counting the pulse. You don't have to necessarily go 1E and a 2E and a. You could just say 1 and E4 and just name the or just say out loud the highlighted notes. And now I just want to quickly show you how we derived the fill from this pattern. So I basically took these highlighted notes here, which is the dotted eighth note pulse, and we're not including the right now, so we're just going to go back to doing our 1 bar pulse where we end on the 4, so it doesn't go over the bar line. And you see here that I have 5 notes, and that was our fill that I was playing. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And again, right, left, right, left, right, left, or you could do the double strokes, right, right, left, left. A lot of different ways you could go about it. So for the purpose of this, I left out the sticking because that's honestly totally open to interpretation. And these are just figures. These are not necessarily any part of the drum kit. This could be the snare. This could be the kick if you want to get adventurous. This could be, cymbals and snare together, all the different toms, whatever floats your boat, essentially. But you have basically the pulse right here, 1, and E4, and there's your quarter note, and that's going to be 4E and a. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that you're not looking at where 1E and a, 2E and a, 3E and a is here, because at this point, these notes are not mathematically adding up to that at all. They don't follow a normal sequence, because in a bar of 16th notes, we have 16 notes, whereas here we have 5, 10, 15, 20, and then 21. So technically this would be odd time if you were trying to actually count the amount of notes. But with something like this, you don't actually look at it that way. You simply just look at how many notes are we playing in the space of what's normally supposed to be there, which in this case, we have a dotted eighth note pulse, which is 1, and E4. And that is something that would normally occupy the space of 3 notes. And we don't have to necessarily pay attention to the fact that it's 16th notes, but that also comes into play when you want to say what kind of a dotted note you're dealing with. So again, this could be played at different speeds and be dotted 16th notes, but the fact of the matter is that it's a dotted note, and you have 3 notes as the sequence because it's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And what we're doing is we're squeezing 5 arbitrary notes, not necessarily any kind of notes. In this case, I just wrote them as 16ths. And they're not actually 16th notes. They're just figures at this point. But the key is you denote that by writing 5:3, which means 5 in the space of where 3 should normally be. So this second note, this second number, is what's supposed to normally be there. And the first number is what you're currently squeezing there. And you can see it is quite a bit of notes to just put within a pulse. And when you hear it in application in the video, if you want to go back and listen to it after seeing this section, you'll notice that it sounds kind of strange at slow speeds because these notes aren't really falling on, 1E and a, 2E and a, 3E and a. It's sort of just up in the air. Your grounding point is the first note of all of these little paragraphs, as I like to call them, right? These are basically now your quarter note groupings. You could look at this the same way that you look at 16th notes to a quarter, right? You have 4 per quarter. In this case now, you have 5, but there's no quarter note here, right? We're not basing this off of a quarter note pulse. We're basing this off of a dotted eighth note pulse. And that's where things for some might get a little bit confusing, but we have 5 notes in the space of where 3 should normally be. And the simplest way to look at that is the beginning of each of these little groupings is the number or letter where the dotted eighth note pulse is falling, 1, and E4. In other words, the highlighted notes here. And this would obviously go over the bar line if we decided to play these 5 notes here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then have something on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then so on and so forth. It would go that full 4-bar sequence and come back to 1 on the 4th bar. So that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed the tutorial as well as the theory explanation. Please leave some feedback in the comments, and don't forget to give a thumbs up and subscribe and turn the notification bell on for more videos coming up soon. I plan to do more of these Gospel Chops videos primarily as the channel's content and the odd drum cover on the side here and there. But essentially I want to really focus on the tutorial aspect because that seems to be what everybody enjoys on the channel, and I want to start having theory sections separate, and if you guys would like a theory video on its own, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know. Thanks and take care.